Chapter 1: The Window of Destiny Dares. The campus radio station, tucked into a quiet corner of the student center, was buzzing with low conversation and the occasional shuffle of notes. Inside the recording booth, Felix adjusted his headphones and glanced at the glowing on-air sign before leaning into the microphone. "Welcome back to Night Talks with Felix." His smooth voice resonated through the airwaves. "Hope you all survived midterms. Now let's dive into something a little more mysterious. Ever heard of the Window of Destiny?" He paused for dramatic effect. "That's right. It's that age-old campus legend. You stand in front of room 459's window on the night of the spring equinox, and supposedly, you see your destined person reflected back at you. Spooky, huh?" Felix smirked as the messages started rolling in through the station's chat board. Some listeners dismissed it as superstition, while others eagerly shared their own variations of the tale. "Let's be real, guys. This is probably just some old student prank that spiraled out of control," Felix continued. "But hey, if anyone's brave enough to test it out this year, let me know. Maybe we can make a segment out of it." "That's ridiculous," Brian scoffed as he tossed his phone onto the dorm room couch. He had been listening to Felix's broadcast, but now he was regretting it. A reflection doesn't determine fate. It's just physics and psychology messing with you. Sam, sprawled across his bed, laughed. "Come on, Brian. Don't you think it'd be fun to at least try?" Brian shot him a flat look. "You want me to go stand in front of a window like an idiot? Pass." "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Logical Thinker. Where's your sense of adventure?" Sam teased. "I dare you to do it." Brian groaned. "Not happening. What if Felix backs me up on this?" Sam grabbed his phone and typed furiously. Moments later, a notification popped up from Felix's radio station chat. "I second Sam's dare. Brian has to do it." Brian glared at Sam. "You're the worst." Across campus, the basketball gym echoed with the rhythmic dribbling of a ball. Kai wiped sweat off his forehead as he wrapped up practice. Eric and Justin approached, both wearing mischievous grins. "Yo, Kai," Eric started, throwing an arm around his teammate's shoulder. "You heard about that Window of Destiny thing?" Kai snorted. "You mean that dumb superstition Felix was talking about on the radio?" "Yeah, what about it?" Justin smirked. "We dare you to try it." Kai rolled his eyes. "Pass." "Scared." Eric goaded. Kai scoffed. "Of some stupid window? Please, I just don't see the point." "Then prove it." Justin crossed his arms. "Unless you're afraid of who you might see." Kai grabbed his gym bag and slung it over his shoulder. "Fine, I'll do it. But when nothing happens, you guys owe me a week of free smoothies." Eric grinned. "Deal." Felix leaned back in his chair as his radio show wrapped up for the night. He checked his messages and laughed when he saw Sam's update. "Brian is in. You better cover this on the next show." Felix smirked to himself. This was going to be fun. Little did they all know, the legend of the Window of Destiny was about to change their lives forever. Chapter 2: A Reflection They Weren't Expecting. The campus at night was an entirely different world. Quieter, almost eerie, with the occasional flicker of streetlights and the distant sound of laughter from dorm rooms. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass from the field nearby. Brian stood in front of room 459, arms crossed, staring at the window that was supposed to reveal his destined person. "All right, let's get this over with," Brian muttered under his breath. Sam and Felix had dared him to do this, laughing the whole time as they pushed him toward the building. He had protested, calling it ridiculous, but here he was, standing before the infamous Window of Destiny. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and looked into the glass. For a split second he saw something, or rather someone. A face, sharp features, intense eyes, messy dark hair. Kai. Brian blinked rapidly. The image lingered, then disappeared, as if the reflection had never been there to begin with. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind quickly went into rationalization mode. "It's just a trick of the light," he told himself. "A reflection, an illusion. Probably my own subconscious projecting someone familiar. With a frustrated shake of his head, he turned away, determined to forget about it. He refused to let some campus legend get to him. Meanwhile, on the other side of campus, Kai was heading back to the gym after a late-night convenience store run with Justin and Eric. "I still can't believe you actually went to the stupid window," Eric said, snickering as he took a sip of his energy drink. "Did you see your soulmate, Kai? Or was it just your own reflection?" Kai rolled his eyes. "It was dumb. There was nothing there." Justin smirked. "You sure? You looked kinda weird after staring at it for so long." Kai scoffed, tossing a small bag of chips at Justin. "Please, even if I did see something, it's just some random nonsense people made up. You really think a piece of glass can show you fate?" He was about to continue when something caught his eye, a figure walking near the edge of the court, illuminated by the dim yellow glow of the streetlights. "Brian." Kai frowned slightly. The guy looked deep in thought, brows furrowed, as if he were arguing with himself. And for some reason, Kai's mind flashed back to the window earlier that night. "No, that's stupid." Shaking off the odd feeling creeping up his spine, Kai forced a laugh. "See? Nothing but superstitious crap." But as they walked past Brian, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Chapter 3: The AI Project Announcement. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the engineering building as Brian settled into his seat, flipping through his notes while Professor Daniel adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "All right, everyone," Daniel began, his voice carrying easily across the lecture hall. "Before we dive into today's topic, I have an exciting project to introduce. One of our research focuses this semester will be the integration of AI-driven analytics into sports performance." He paused, scanning the room. "And to spearhead this project, I've chosen Brian." Brian's head jerked up, startled. "Wait, what?" Daniel smiled. "I've already spoken with the athletics department, and they've agreed to let us run a trial with the basketball team. You'll be working directly with Coach Matt and the players to apply AI-assisted strategies to real games." Murmurs spread across the room. Sam, sitting beside Brian, nudged him. "Dude, this is huge." Brian, still processing, exhaled slowly. "Yeah, huge." That afternoon, Brian found himself standing beside Daniel at the university's outdoor basketball courts. The rhythmic pounding of basketballs against the pavement mixed with the shouts of players calling out plays. Matt, arms crossed, was addressing the team. "All right, listen up." Matt's voice cut through the noise. "Starting today, we'll be working with the engineering department on a special project, analyzing and improving our gameplay with AI. He nodded toward Brian. "This is Brian, and he'll be handling the data integration. He's here to help, not replace anyone, so don't start whining." Brian gave an awkward nod, stuffing his hands into his hoodie pocket. The players exchanged glances, some intrigued, others indifferent. Then there was Kai, his brows furrowed, his arms tightly crossed. Wait. AI? Are we serious right now?" His voice carried a sharp edge. Matt sighed. "Yes, Kai, we are." Kai scoffed. "Basketball isn't some math equation you can just compute and optimize. It's instincts, reaction, teamwork. You can't reduce the game to numbers." Brian finally spoke up, keeping his tone even. "It's not about reducing the game. It's about enhancing decision-making. Patterns, tendencies, you might be reacting on instinct, but that instinct is built on repeated scenarios. AI can help identify them more precisely." Kai rolled his eyes. "Right, so now we're going to have a computer tell us when to shoot? What's next, replacing players with robots?" Justin, who had been dribbling lazily nearby, let out a low whistle. "Damn, Kai, chill. It's just a trial. You afraid of a little data?" Kai shot him a glare. "I'm not afraid of anything. I just don't want some guy who's never played a day in his life telling me how to play my game." Eric, standing beside Justin, finally spoke. "Look, I get the skepticism, but maybe we at least hear them out? If it helps, great. If not, we move on. No harm, right?" Kai exhaled sharply, clearly still irritated. But Eric's logic seemed to at least make him hesitate. Matt clapped his hands. All right, enough debating. Practice starts now. Brian, you and Daniel can sit in on drills. Brian exchanged a glance with Kai, who still looked unconvinced. This was going to be a long project. Chapter 4. The Bet Numbers versus Instinct. The tension between Kai and Brian had been palpable ever since the AI project was announced. Every time they were in the same room, the air practically crackled with unspoken arguments and sharp glares. Kai was still fuming from the meeting at the basketball court, and Brian, though outwardly composed, found himself increasingly irritated by Kai's stubborn resistance. It all came to a head one late afternoon in the gym. The basketball team was in the middle of their regular practice, with Matt observing from the sidelines. Brian, clipboard in hand, stood nearby, analyzing movements and taking notes. The rest of the team had started to get used to his presence, but Kai, as expected, wasn't thrilled. Brian, standing at the edge of the court, called out to Matt. Coach, the data from today's scrimmage suggests that Kai has a slight delay in his reaction when defending against a left-handed player. Kai, who was toweling off his sweat, whipped his head around. Excuse me? His voice carried across the gym. Brian remained unfazed. The numbers show that you hesitate a fraction of a second longer against left-handed shots. If you adjusted your stance slightly, you could cut down that reaction time. Kai tossed his towel aside and marched toward Brian. You think some stupid numbers can tell me how to play? Basketball is about instincts, not spreadsheets. Brian met Kai's glare evenly. Instincts are important, but data can help refine them. If you actually looked at the analysis, you'd see it. Eric and Justin, standing off to the side, exchanged amused glances. Oh boy, here we go again, Eric muttered under his breath. Justin chuckled. You think they'll ever just get along? Doubt it. But this is way more entertaining. Kai scoffed and crossed his arms. All right, genius. If your precious data is so good, let's put it to the test. 1-on-1. You score on me. I'll listen to whatever your numbers say. The challenge had everyone's attention now. Felix, who had just arrived and was watching from the bleachers, leaned forward with interest. Wait, did Brian just get challenged by Kai? This I gotta see. Sam, sitting next to him, nodded. I think Brian's about to regret his entire life choice. Matt, who had been watching the exchange with mild amusement, finally stepped in. All right. If you two want to settle this with a game, fine. But keep it under control. Brian adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. Fine. Let's do it. The gym erupted into murmurs as players gathered around to watch. Justin nudged Eric. Think Brian stands a chance? Eric shook his head. No way. Kai's one of the best defenders on the team. Brian doesn't play. This is going to be over in 5 seconds. The two took their positions. Brian, who had never played competitive basketball in his life, dribbled the ball awkwardly. Kai smirked, already anticipating an easy block. First to 1 point, Kai said. Let's go. Brian inhaled deeply, his mind racing through calculations. He knew he couldn't match Kai in speed or strength, so his only hope was strategy. He dribbled cautiously, watching Kai's stance. His earlier analysis flashed through his mind, Kai's slight hesitation against left-handed moves. Taking a calculated risk, Brian faked right but quickly shifted left, forcing Kai into that split-second delay. It was barely noticeable, but for Brian it was enough. He drove forward and, with an awkward but well-timed shot, sent the ball toward the hoop. It hit the backboard and, to everyone's shock, dropped in. The gym fell silent for a split second before erupting into shouts. No freaking way! Felix shouted from the bleachers. Eric's jaw dropped. He actually did it. Justin let out a low whistle. Damn, the nerd really just scored on Kai. Kai stood frozen, staring at the hoop. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze back to Brian, who adjusted his glasses and gave a small, smug smile. Looks like the data was right. The silence was deafening before Kai finally let out a disbelieving laugh. All right, genius. You got lucky, but a deal's a deal. What now? Brian, still trying to steady his racing heartbeat, simply said, "Now? You listen." Chapter 5, Unwanted Awareness. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gym floor as the basketball team wrapped up their practice. The sound of sneakers squeaking against polished wood mixed with the rhythmic pounding of the ball. Kai was running drills with the rest of the team, but his mind wasn't entirely on the game. Not that he'd admit it, but he was still thinking about Brian. The guy was analytical to a fault, but his calculated move from their one-on-one still nagged at him. Kai had played against countless skilled opponents, but there was something different about this. Brian wasn't a basketball player, yet he'd managed to land a clean shot. It wasn't talent, it wasn't instinct, it was something else. Something Kai wasn't sure he liked. "Yo, you good?" Eric clapped a hand on Kai's shoulder as they walked toward the bench. "I'm fine." Kai grabbed his water bottle and took a long swig, trying to shake off his irritation. "Mm-hmm." Eric smirked knowingly. "Not still thinking about that AI nerd, are you?" Kai rolled his eyes. "Why the hell would I be thinking about him? Because you're pissed he actually scored on you?" Justin chimed in, tossing his towel onto the bench. "That's gotta sting." Kai scowled. "One shot. He got lucky." Felix, who had been lounging nearby, perked up at the mention of Brian. "Oh? Are we talking about our dear friend Brian and his sudden basketball prowess?" "We're not talking about him," Kai said flatly, but the others ignored him. "I gotta admit," Justin said, leaning back against the bench, "it was kind of funny watching you freak out over it." "I didn't freak out." Felix snorted. "Dude, you looked like someone had just told you Santa Claus isn't real." Kai groaned, rubbing his face. "You guys are annoying." Eric smirked. "And you're still talking about Brian, so..." Kai shot him a glare but didn't respond. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Meanwhile, Brian was in the engineering lab, staring blankly at his laptop screen. He was supposed to be analyzing some player movement data, but his thoughts kept drifting. Specifically to a certain someone who had looked absolutely furious after that one-on-one game. Kai had been livid, but more than that he'd looked intrigued. Brian wasn't oblivious to people's reactions. He could tell when someone was actually mad versus when they were covering up something else. And Kai was covering up something. "Why do you look like you're solving a murder?" Sam asked, sliding into the seat next to him. Brian blinked. "What? You've been staring at that screen for like 5 minutes without typing a single thing." Brian sighed. "It's nothing." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Does nothing have anything to do with a certain basketball player who's been scowling at you all week?" Brian hesitated for a split second too long. Sam's grin widened. "Oh my God. Totally does." "Drop it," Brian muttered. But Sam was already grinning like he'd won the lottery. "You know, I think it's kind of funny," Sam mused. "He acts like he hates you, but you two are basically circling each other like some kind of slow-burn rivals too." "Stop," Sam chuckled. Fine. But seriously, do you actually think this project is going to work?" Brian exhaled, turning his focus back to the data. "I don't know. I think the numbers are solid. But whether or not the team will actually use the system..." He trailed off, thinking about Kai's reaction. "Yeah, I wouldn't count on Kai making things easy for you," Sam said. "He's got that whole basketball is my religion thing going on." Brian scoffed. "I noticed." Later that evening, Brian found himself back at the gym, this time observing practice from the sidelines. He told himself he was just there to gather more data, but a small part of him knew that wasn't entirely true. He found himself watching Kai more than he watched the game itself. Kai moved like he was made for the court. His reflexes, his instincts, the way he seemed to predict movements before they even happened, it was all so effortless. Brian could break down the physics of it, the angles and momentum, but there was something raw about the way Kai played that defied simple calculations. Felix, who had also been hanging around, nudged Justin. "You see that?" Justin smirked. "Oh yeah, classic." Brian glanced at them, suspicious. "See what?" Felix grinned. "You watching Kai like he's the next big research paper you're about to write." Brian frowned. "I'm analyzing movement patterns." "Aha." Justin stretched lazily. Just admit it. You're intrigued. Brian didn't answer, but the silence was telling. Felix leaned in conspiratorially. I give it a month before you two are either best friends or killing each other. Brian sighed. He wasn't sure which was more likely. Chapter 6. Locked in the gym. The gym was eerily quiet at this hour, the usual echoes of sneakers squeaking against the polished wooden floor absent. Overhead lights cast long, stretched-out shadows along the bleachers and court, making the massive space feel both vast and suffocating at the same time. Kai dribbled a ball absent-mindedly, the rhythmic sound the only thing breaking the silence. Brian sat cross-legged a few feet away, his tablet balanced on his knee, running simulations for the AI-assisted training program. He was so absorbed in his analysis that he didn't seem to notice Kai's restless movements, or maybe he just chose to ignore them. It wasn't until the distant sound of a door clicking shut echoed across the gym that either of them looked up. Kai frowned, bouncing the ball one last time before catching it. Did someone just... He turned towards the exit, striding over confidently. He pushed against the door. It didn't budge. Brian watched as Kai gave it another shove, then another, before groaning in frustration. Don't tell me. We're locked in. Kai's voice was flat, his hands now braced against the doorframe. He turned back, irritation written all over his face. Great. Fantastic. Brian raised a brow. Did you check if it's just stuck or actually locked? Kai shot him a look but tried again, rattling the handle aggressively before stepping back with an exasperated sigh. You want to try? Brian stood, placing his tablet aside before calmly walking over. He gave the door a measured tug. It remained firmly in place. Well, he said after a beat. It's locked. Kai let out a sharp laugh. Oh, wow. Thanks for confirming that, genius. Brian ignored the sarcasm. Do you have your phone? Kai patted his pockets, scowling when he came up empty. I left it in my bag. His eyes flicked to Brian. What about you? Brian checked his pocket and pulled out his phone, only to be met with a single bar of reception. He pressed the power button, and the screen flickered off. Battery's dead. Kai threw his hands up. Of course it is. He turned back toward the court, rubbing a hand over his face. So what? We wait until someone finds us. Brian took a seat on the bleachers, exhaling slowly. Looks like it. Kai muttered something under his breath before dropping onto the floor near the free throw line, leaning back on his palms. Unbelievable. Minutes passed in silence. Then Brian, as usual, couldn't leave things unsaid. If you hadn't stayed back to practice, we wouldn't be in this situation. Kai scoffed. Oh, right. Like you weren't the one obsessing over your damn algorithms. Brian tilted his head slightly. Obsessing? I call it research. Kai rolled his eyes. Yeah, well, research isn't going to teach someone how to actually play the game. You don't win by plugging numbers into a computer. Brian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. And yet, those numbers predicted your movements almost perfectly. Kai stiffened. I wasn't playing seriously. Brian smirked. Of course you weren't. Kai sat up straighter, scowling. Basketball is about instinct. You can't just predict someone's passion or drive with stats. Brian studied him for a moment, then spoke, voice quieter but firm. Passion doesn't always win games. Strategy does. Kai narrowed his eyes. So you really believe everything is just calculations? That there's no such thing as fate or gut feeling? Brian let out a breath. I believe people make their own choices. They create their own outcomes. Kai tilted his head. What about the window of destiny? Brian hesitated. He hadn't expected Kai to bring that up. What about it? Kai gave a lopsided grin, though there was something unreadable behind his expression. You saw me, didn't you? Brian's fingers curled slightly. It was a trick of the light. Kai hummed, unconvinced. If you don't believe in fate, then why did it shake you up? Brian didn't answer right away. Maybe because it didn't make sense. Kai leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Or maybe because you know there's something more to it than just numbers. Brian opened his mouth to respond but stopped when he noticed how close they were now. The air between them felt charged, like a silent challenge neither was willing to back down from. Kai's gaze flickered down for just a second. Barely noticeable, but enough for Brian to catch it. He swallowed, pulse quickening against his will. For the first time, the tension between them didn't feel like rivalry. It felt like something else entirely. Kai parted his lips slightly as if about to say something. Then the gym doors creaked open. They jerked apart instantly, Kai scrambling to his feet as Brian exhaled sharply and looked away. A janitor stood at the entrance, frowning. "You two still here?" "Gym's closed." Kai cleared his throat, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah. Got locked in." The janitor muttered something about careless students before waving them off. "Go on, get out." Brian grabbed his tablet, keeping his expression neutral as he followed Kai toward the exit. Neither of them spoke as they stepped out into the cool night air. But as Kai shoved his hands into his pockets, he cast a quick glance at Brian, brows slightly furrowed, as if still trying to make sense of whatever had just happened. And Brian, for the first time, had no logical explanation to give. Chapter 7. The Shift in Strategy and Feelings. The tension on the court was different now. Kai, who had always dismissed Brian's AI-driven suggestions as nonsense, found himself unconsciously adjusting to them. The result? The team was actually performing better. The thought irritated him to no end. Brian, standing by the sidelines, observed Kai with a mix of professional curiosity and something else, something he wasn't ready to name yet. His usual focus on numbers and strategies was faltering whenever Kai was involved. The way Kai moved, the way he instinctively adjusted his play, the fire in his expression when he executed a perfect drive to the basket. It was fascinating. Justin nudged Eric as they watched Kai steal a glance at Brian after a particularly successful play. "Did you see that?" He looked right at him. Eric smirked. "Yeah, and Brian's been watching him like he's running diagnostics on a high-end machine. Something's up." Kai huffed as he wiped sweat off his brow. He knew the new strategies were working, but he didn't want to admit that Brian's data analysis had anything to do with it. Yet, his own instincts told him otherwise. Against his will, he found his eyes drifting toward Brian again, catching the way Brian was focused solely on him, brow furrowed in deep thought. He scowled. "What the hell are you staring at?" Brian, caught off guard, pushed his glasses up. "Analyzing your movement patterns. You adjusted to the system faster than anticipated." TCH. Kai rolled his eyes but felt his face heat up for no damn reason. "Stop analyzing me like I'm some kind of experiment." Justin, overhearing the exchange, leaned in toward Eric with a knowing grin. "I give it a week before one of them snaps." Eric chuckled. "I say 3 days. The tension is getting unbearable." Kai turned back to the game, but he couldn't shake off the awareness of Brian's gaze. And Brian, for the first time, found himself struggling to see Kai as just another variable in his calculations. Because somewhere in the data, in the movements, in the analysis, Kai had become something more. Chapter 8. The Big Game and the Rift. The gym was packed, the air thick with anticipation. The crowd roared as the university's basketball team took to the court, their sneakers squeaking against the polished wood. Brian sat on the sidelines, laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard as he analyzed real-time data from the game. His AI model had been running simulations for weeks, and now it was crunching live inputs to predict player movement, shot accuracy, and defensive weaknesses. Kai was in the center of the court, bouncing on the balls of his feet as he waited for the referee's whistle. His mind was clear, body buzzing with adrenaline. He didn't need numbers or simulations to know how to play basketball. He had instincts, years of experience, and the unshakable confidence of someone who knew their game inside and out. As the game progressed, Brian noticed a flaw. He furrowed his brow, eyes scanning the court as his AI highlighted patterns in Kai's movement. The opposing team had picked up on Kai's preference for driving left, subtly adjusting their defense to cut him off. If he kept playing the way he always did, they would trap him, forcing turnovers. Brian quickly scribbled a note on his tablet and signaled Matt, who nodded and called for a timeout. Kai jogged toward the bench, wiping sweat off his forehead with his jersey. "What's the problem?" Brian held up the tablet, showing a heat map of Kai's movements. "They've adjusted. You keep going left, and they're waiting for you. You need to mix it up. Drive right more often." Kai scoffed, grabbing a water bottle and taking a long sip. "I know my game. I don't need a computer telling me how to play." Matt exhaled, glancing between them. "Kai, just listen for a second. Brian's model has been accurate so far. If he's seeing a pattern, it's worth considering." Kai shook his head. "Basketball isn't about numbers, it's about feel. I trust my instincts." Brian clenched his jaw, frustration flickering across his face. "Your instincts are great, but they're predictable. And if you don't change something, they're going to shut you down." The buzzer signaled the end of the timeout, and Kai turned away, heading back onto the court. "Watch me." The game resumed, and at first, Kai's usual aggressive playstyle seemed to be holding up. He drove left, dodged defenders, and managed to sink a few shots. But as Brian had predicted, the opposing team caught on. They double-teamed him, cutting off passing lanes, forcing bad shots. The tide shifted. The home team fell behind, and frustration boiled in Kai's chest. From the sidelines, Brian watched the inevitable unfold. He saw the opening before Kai did, saw the moment where the strategy needed to shift. And then, something happened. Kai hesitated. For the first time in the game, he looked over at Brian. Their eyes met. Just a second, a flicker of hesitation. Brian didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. The data, the numbers, everything they had argued about. Kai understood it in that moment. He took a deep breath and drove right. The defenders, caught off guard, scrambled to adjust. Kai found himself open in a way he hadn't been all night. He cut to the basket, passing the ball at the last second to Eric, who sank a perfect three-pointer. The crowd erupted. Kai's heart pounded as the game intensified. He mixed up his movements, alternating between instinct and calculated plays. The gap closed. With seconds left on the clock, the ball was in his hands. He faked left, just enough for the defender to bite, then pivoted right, rising for a clean, unguarded shot. The ball swished through the net just as the final buzzer sounded. Victory. The gym exploded into cheers. The team rushed the court, celebrating, slapping Kai on the back. Matt grinned from the sidelines, and Brian just stood there watching. Kai turned, breathless, sweat dripping down his face. His chest was heaving, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. And for some reason, the first person he looked for wasn't his teammates, it was Brian. Brian, who had seen something in his game no one else had. Brian, who hadn't just analyzed his plays but understood them in a way Kai hadn't expected. For the first time, Kai didn't just respect Brian's intelligence. He felt something shift, something he wasn't ready to name. And from the way Brian looked at him, wide-eyed and just as breathless, Kai had a feeling he wasn't the only one. Chapter 9. A New Bet. The tension between Kai and Brian hadn't dissipated after the big game. If anything, it had evolved into something more complicated, an unspoken challenge that neither of them was willing to voice aloud. The team's victory had proven that Brian's data-driven approach had merit, but Kai still clung to his instincts, refusing to believe that numbers could ever replace the feeling of the game. That's how they found themselves back at the gym, after hours, with only the dim overhead lights illuminating the polished court. The rest of the team had left, but Kai had stayed behind, casually dribbling a basketball, his expression unreadable. Brian, standing a few feet away, had his arms crossed, observing Kai with an analytical gaze. Kai finally broke the silence. "All right, nerd. Let's settle this once and for all." Brian raised an eyebrow. "Settle what?" Kai spun the ball in his hands, his smirk sharp and challenging. "You and your damn numbers. You think they can predict everything, right? That stats and calculations can define how a player performs." Brian didn't even hesitate. "It's not about predicting everything, but understanding patterns. Knowing what works best based on probabilities." Kai scoffed. "Right, so let's make a bet." He stepped to the free throw line and bounced the ball once before tossing it to Brian. "If you can make a single free throw using your so-called calculations, I'll admit your numbers have value. But if you miss, you have to admit that there's something in this world that goes beyond logic, beyond what can be measured. Brian caught the ball, feeling the weight of it in his hands. His fingers traced the grooves as he considered the bet. It wasn't like he hadn't made a free throw before. Logically, he knew the angle, the force, the arc. But he also knew that sometimes, even perfect calculations failed in the face of unpredictable human elements. "You're serious?" Brian asked, glancing up at Kai, who was watching him with a knowing expression. Kai shrugged. "What? You scared? Thought you'd jump at the chance to prove me wrong." Brian exhaled sharply. "Fine. One shot." He stepped up to the free throw line, adjusting his stance. He mentally calculated the angle, the force needed, the trajectory. He bounced the ball twice, exhaled, and took the shot. The ball soared through the air in a near-perfect arc. Kai's eyes tracked its movement. But just as it seemed like it would land cleanly in the hoop, it hit the rim, bouncing once, twice, before finally falling in. Kai blinked. "Ha!" Brian turned to face him, expression neutral but with a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "That counts." Kai crossed his arms, rolling his tongue inside his cheek. "Barely." Brian smirked. "But it still counts." Kai sighed dramatically, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fine. Maybe your numbers aren't complete bullshit." He eyed Brian for a moment before adding, "But that was luck. Admit it." Brian tilted his head. "Or maybe it was skill informed by data." Kai snorted but didn't argue. Instead, he simply grabbed the ball and tossed it back to Brian. "All right, genius. Let's see if you can do it twice." Brian caught the ball, the challenge clear in Kai's eyes. He wasn't sure when their arguments had turned into something like this, something that felt less like rivalry and more like something else entirely. But as he stepped up for another shot, he found that he didn't mind it at all. Chapter 10. The Confession. The basketball court was empty except for the two of them. The overhead lights cast long shadows on the polished floor, their reflections distorted by the scuff marks left behind by countless games. The air was thick with unspoken words, heavy breaths, and the quiet tension that had built between them for weeks. Kai dribbled the ball absent-mindedly, the rhythmic sound echoing through the vast space. Brian stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching him with an unreadable expression. "So," Kai started, bouncing the ball once more before catching it and spinning it in his hands. "You still don't believe in fate?" Brian exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "I don't." Kai snorted. "Figures." He shot the ball toward the hoop and it sank in effortlessly. He retrieved it and turned to face Brian fully. "Then explain this." Brian tilted his head. "Explain what?" Kai took a step closer. "Explain how you, some numbers-obsessed, logic-driven, AI-worshipping nerd, ended up on my team, messing with my game, making me rethink everything I thought I knew. Explain how every time I look at you, I feel like I've already lost, and I don't even know what game I'm playing." Brian's breath hitched. He hadn't expected this. He had seen every move Kai made on the court, analyzed every pattern in his playing style, but he hadn't accounted for this, Kai standing in front of him, looking at him like that, like he was something impossible. Brian swallowed. "That's not fate," he said, voice lower than he intended. "That's just..." Kai stepped even closer. "That's just what?" Brian licked his lips. He had spent so long dismissing fate, arguing against it, refusing to believe in it. But when he looked at Kai now, standing inches away, the weight of his presence so overwhelming it made his chest tight, he realized something. "I don't believe in fate," Brian admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I believe in you." Kai's breath hitched this time. His fingers curled into fists at his sides before he exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. Then he laughed softly, almost disbelievingly. "You're such an idiot." Brian didn't get a chance to respond before Kai closed the distance between them completely, grabbing the front of Brian's hoodie and pulling him in. The kiss was quick at first, as if Kai was testing the waters, but the second Brian responded, hands gripping Kai's arms, pulling him in closer, it deepened. The taste of sweat, mint gum, and something unmistakably Kai filled Brian's senses. The warmth of Kai's hands burned through the fabric of his hoodie, and Brian felt his heartbeat skyrocket, thudding against his ribs like it was trying to break free. When they finally pulled apart, Kai was grinning, slightly breathless. Still think everything can be explained by numbers? Brian's lips quirked up in a small, reluctant smile. Not everything. Kai hummed in approval, tapping a finger against Brian's chest. Good answer. They stood there, the weight of what just happened settling between them. But for once, neither of them felt the need to overanalyze it. The game was over, and somehow they had both won. Epilogue: a window of possibilities. The campus buzzed with the last remnants of spring, a gentle breeze weaving through the trees as students milled about, some rushing to class, others lingering under the warm sun. The basketball court, now an almost sacred place for Kai and Brian, stood empty at this hour, the echoes of past games still lingering in the silence. Felix's voice crackled over the speakers of the campus radio station. And that wraps up today's segment. But before we go, hey, have you guys heard? The spring equinox is coming up, which means it's time for the infamous Window of Destiny tradition again. Any believers out there? Any skeptics? Maybe some of you are secretly hoping to catch a glimpse of your fated person. He chuckled. Who knows? Fate works in weird ways. Brian and Kai stood in front of the radio station's bulletin board, where someone had posted a new thread about the legend. Brian shook his head with a smirk. Still think it's just a bunch of nonsense? Kai folded his arms, tilting his head at Brian. I don't know. You tell me. Because according to legend, if you see someone in that window, they're your so-called destined person. He took a deliberate step closer. And yet, here we are. Brian exhaled a quiet laugh. Yeah, here we are. A comfortable silence stretched between them. Kai reached out and laced their fingers together, a casual yet deliberate gesture. It wasn't something new, not anymore, but it still made Brian's pulse skip just a little. At that moment, Sam and Eric strolled by, engaged in a hushed conversation until Eric spotted them and grinned. Well, if it isn't the dynamic duo. Should we start calling you two the Window's chosen ones? Felix teased, suddenly appearing beside them. Justin, munching on a protein bar, raised an eyebrow. Honestly, I'm just surprised Kai isn't denying anything anymore. Kai rolled his eyes. I've got better things to do than argue about fate with you guys. Like what? Brian quipped. Spending more time running AI simulations with me? Kai groaned, but there was no real frustration in it. You're impossible. Brian only smiled, pressing a fleeting kiss to Kai's temple before walking ahead. Kai stood there for a moment, blinking, before quickly catching up, trying to mask the way his ears turned pink. Behind them, their friends exchanged knowing looks. As the sun began to set over the university, the campus remained alive with chatter, games, and the ever-present whispers of legends. And though Brian and Kai didn't need a mysterious window to tell them what they already knew, they still found themselves, later that night, standing outside room 459, looking up at the glass pane reflecting their intertwined fates. Neither of them said it aloud, but in that moment they knew some things logic couldn't explain. And maybe, just maybe, they were okay with that.